Great. Okay, so we're ready to kick off. Well, without further ado, I'll pass over to Ella, who's going to talk to you all about pitch decks in the COVID funding crisis. Over to you, Ella.
Cool. Hi, everyone. So yeah, as Oscar said, I'm here to talk about pitch decks, specifically because of the challenges we're all experiencing at the moment. We feel that these things are particularly important right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm firstly just going to talk a bit about the general situation that we've got at the moment, look at some of the opportunities and challenges that presents, and then I'm going to talk through some specific pointers and tips that hopefully will be useful for you when you're creating and working on your pitch decks. So firstly, let's look a bit at the situation. So on one hand, sales of games are up. People are playing more games, they're spending more money on games. In fact, in the US, data shows that 37% of players are actually spending more on games than they did before. Why? Well, probably mainly time. But actually, we also think that games, obviously provide a sense of completion, competition, and of control. And, these things really help build self-esteem. They provide escapism and a sense of empowerment, all of which are really important for people right now. And particularly where games are also sociable, it really allows players to have meaningful experiences with other people remotely. On the other hand, a recent European survey found that 17% of European game studios think that they may be forced to close within 3 months. That's pretty drastic and very worrying. And the most affected studios that they found within that are those who are small, pre-revenue, and particularly those who are looking for funding. So why is there this problem when more players are spending money? And I think, really what we need to be doing is looking beyond the right now, because yes, right now players are spending more money, but, everybody is assuming that there's going to be a global recession. So whilst games are doing well right now, we're weathering this storm better than most, or maybe even all industries. But if there is going to be a global recession, then players will have less money to spend. And whilst hopefully games will weather that better than other industries, we're still going to, there's still going to be consequences. There will be less money available for investment generally. That's not to say that all investors have stopped investing by any means. Not even all of them have slowed down. So there is still money out there, but it is more difficult, and it clearly is worrying developers at the moment. So just want to look at a few opportunities, because I always like to try and look at the upsides of things as well as the challenges. So firstly, for those of you who already have a game on the market, there really is an opportunity to increase revenues right now. Depending what platform you're on, there's more opportunity than others. But actually, I think there's a longer opportunity here, which is to plan now for when life goes back to normal, whatever that's going to be. If you can invest in building meaningful relationships with players right now, it can help you reduce the impact of the upcoming recession when people are spending less money. Because if you can get more players already engaged, then whilst they may stop spending so much each, you will have more of them. So particularly for games where you obviously have large player bases, if you can take the time and put the effort into building those relationships now, I really think it will be one of the key factors in helping you to weather the challenges that are going to come over the next year or two. And then we have lower cost per install. So whilst, so CPI for ads in general has dropped, whilst existing games, this is a challenge for them because they're going to see a drop in revenue. Actually, if you are not yet launched, this is an opportunity for you because you can take advantage of that lower CPI during launch and growth. So if you have a game that uses ads, you probably need to be looking to adjust your monetization strategy and your forecast to account for this. And it presents an opportunity for you to acquire users more effectively. And then, slight curveball, but I do think it's important to say because, we all know that games impact people's behavior. And, that's where games as a purpose comes in. The opportunities to use game theory and game technology for non-game purposes is not anything new. But we have definitely seen an increase in interest from non-games companies and sectors in using games because obviously the current situation, they need to do that. So, around training, around game technology, I think there's a lot of opportunities here. And if companies want to find new revenue streams, whether that's a key strategy or whether that's potentially to help you with cash flow, you know, whilst this crisis is happening. You know, I think there are opportunities there. And, you know, I should say those sort of companies, you know, the big corporates and things like that do actually have money to spend on helping them to solve their problems. And then I think the other thing actually is more of a macro environment factor, but, you know, public perception. You know, everybody in our industry, we know that games are not primarily just played by a certain demographic or gender. You know, we know they're played by everybody. We know that they're mostly a positive experience that should be encouraged. But, you know, we have as an industry sometimes struggled a bit with messaging. And my hope is that the importance of relevance of games in this crisis will help to demonstrate that more widely. The WHO campaign within the games industry recently, where they've been promoting games as a way to stay socially active while safe, is, I hope, a sign of things to come. And it's a very different messaging from what the WHO has been saying over the last few years. So I think this really presents opportunities for games to reach new audiences and markets. But it's not all good news, unfortunately. So the challenges. Firstly, if you're raising money, you need to assume it's going to take longer. You might be a lucky one and it might not. And that's, you know, hopefully that's the case. But the reality is that there is less money and there are, you know, investors are more cautious. So things could take longer. And in my experience, most companies tend to underestimate anyway how long these things are going to take to raise money. You know, so whereas before this crisis, we probably would have suggested 6 to 12 months runway. You know, realistically, you should be trying to prepare for 18 to 24 months. Now, like I said, hopefully that won't be the case, but, you know, you have to prepare for the worst case scenario. You have to, as a company, to try and survive, you know, the time period that it takes you to raise money. And I think, you know, to be sensible, looking at expanding your runway as long as possible is definitely a key activity that I would advise. Investment is more competitive, as I said already. Less investment available, investors being more cautious means that it's become more competitive. You need to make sure that your proposition is attractive. You need to make sure that you stand out from a crowd. And you also need to make sure that your business plan and your pitch considers the macro environmental factors right now. So, you know, the investors are going to want to see that you're planning for a potential global recession. They're going to want to see that you're planning for whatever other impacts the current situation could have. And actually, that may also mean planning for opportunities that are presented by it. But it's definitely something that, you know, I would expect to see covered in business plans and, you know, in pitches in some way, whether that's in writing or, you know, discussed. But it should be something that you're all thinking about and putting in place for your businesses. It's harder to meet and pitch to investors. So, you know, a lot of events have been cancelled. And there are, you know, some are operating digitally, and I think actually in a lot of cases doing a great job. But, you know, it still is harder to meet investors. And I think, you know, it is harder to pitch digitally. So actually, you know, it's not just more difficult to meet them, but actually to make that first impression and to really engage and build that relationship is more of a challenge. And I think, you know, beyond that, that isn't going anywhere. You know, digital meetings are here to stay. Now, this is my opinion. You might disagree, but you know, we will have in-person events again one day, and I can't wait. But it's probably not going to be this year. And even when it does happen, I suspect it's going to happen slowly. And I think even then, that in the long term, you know, we're going to keep seeing digital meetings because actually the cost and time of doing so is so much more efficient. That I expect that we'll end up with some kind of mixture. So we may have in-person only events, we may have digital only events, but we may have some that are mixed. But, you know, to sort of go into what we're specifically here to talk about, you know, pitch decks are a really important part of that process. Having a great pitch deck has always been important, you know, but I think that's becoming even more critical if you're not able to meet face to face. So that's what I'm going to talk a bit more about. So I'm going to go through various different tips about how to think about your pitch deck. So the first thing is, what type of funding are you pitching for? And I know this sounds obvious, but I very, very, very regularly see pitches that are suitable for, say, a publisher submitted as a pitch for an equity investor. Now, I'm specifically talking about pitches for equity investors today. There are big differences. If you are looking to pitch for both, which is absolutely a good strategy, you need to have two different pitch decks. I don't believe there's any way to have one pitch deck that is just, even with minor edits, suitable for both. I'm not going to go through this in detail. We can share these slides another time, but every section of your pitch deck will have a different focus if it's a company versus a game, if you're looking for company investment versus game funding. So that's the first thing, who you're pitching for. And then who are you pitching to? So you may be pitching to industry experts one minute, but the next you may be pitching to investors who aren't specialists in games. Most events that I go to have investors from both sides of those. So unless you're really going to kind of only approach a few key target investors that you already know, you need to assume that you will at some point be pitching to people that aren't experts. And even if the people that you pitch to are experts, they may have other people in their company who aren't. And this deck and your proposition will have to go through various stages internally. So you can't assume that everybody who reads this is going to really understand the details of games. And to be honest, even if they do, you need to make sure your pitch is understandable. There is no reason that you can't explain it in a way that anybody can understand it. And I love this Einstein quote because I think it's so true. It's actually really difficult to explain something complicated in a simple way, but that's what shows that you really understand your proposition. Now, you may need to go into more detail to explain aspects of it to justify your argument, but that doesn't mean that you can't explain your overall proposition in a way that's understandable to everybody. So first things you do, you've got 30 seconds to make an impression. Now, actually, Oscar did some research into this after I told him this, and he came back and said, actually, it's 12 seconds. So I'm sticking with 30 because 12 just sounds terrifyingly short. But I think the principle is you've got to get somebody to understand what you're saying and get their attention in a very, very, very short space of time. It's just like a player in a game. If you're pitching to them in person, you want to get them as interested as possible, as interested as quickly as possible. If you're sending a pitch deck for review, you want them to be able to understand it by reading it as quickly as possible. Don't make them sit and listen to or read through the entire deck to understand what you're pitching to them. Get your key points across immediately, set the scene, and then use the rest of the pitch to back it up and to explain in more detail. So there are different ways to do this. I've seen pitch decks that do this differently to how I'm about to suggest, but what I usually suggest is that your first slide, call it your executive summary, overview, whatever you like, needs to outline the proposition. And that means the following things. Say what your company does. And you'd be surprised how often this isn't stated or isn't clear. I think partly sometimes because people assume, well, they know we make games. Well, no, say it. What is it that defines your company as well? It's not just that you make games. You obviously make a certain type of game. You specialize in a certain area, and it's not just what your first game is, it's what your business does. So your first game should be an example of what your business is. And then why do you exist? Why is your company relevant now? Why will players care? What is the gap in the market you've identified? Is there a disruption? It's not just that you're making a game that you want to make, that there needs to be a market reason for you to exist. And then what your goals are. So what are you trying to achieve as a company? Are you trying to be the leading strategy game studio in the world? Are you trying to get bought out by Google? I'm still on the previous slide, thanks, Oscar. Why are you the right people to do this? So, what is it about your team that means the investor should trust that you can deliver? How many years experience do you have? Have you won awards? Have you had previous games that have made a lot of money? Some key stats on there to show why you are the people they should trust. And then where are you now? So, how old is the company? What have you done so far? How far along is your current project? Do you have any revenues? If you don't, that's fine, but that's important to say. And then what you need and what you'll do with the money. So how much money you need. It's amazing how many pitches really make you work to try and work that out. Often the best case scenario is on the very last page. So I have to go through the whole thing to try and work that out. But actually, in a lot of cases, it's not even that clear. So, and then I want to know what you're going to do with the money. So is the money going to get you to soft launch? Is the money going to get you to make 3 games? Will it give you 12 months runway or will it be 24 months runway? What is it as a summary that you're going to do with that money? And then, why is it an interesting proposition for them? Which basically means what will they get out of it? So how much money could they make? And really the easiest way to say that, how much do you expect to make after 3 years or 5 years, whatever your forecast shows. and you know, it's really important to talk about these points, not just at the beginning to set the scene, but actually because investors have criteria for the investments they can make. You might have the best pitch in the world, but if it doesn't fit their criteria, they won't be able to invest anyway. And actually, it's really important for everybody to be able to gauge that up front. So once you've set the scene, you then want to take players on the journey. So, you know, your goal with a pitch deck overall really should be to leave the person you're presenting to, or that you sent the deck to, wanting to know more. But what you don't want is to leave them with questions about the core proposition. So once you've set the scene, the way I think about it is you're taking the reader on a journey, by which I mean that the flow of information in the pitch deck should really build the picture of your company and its goals in the mind of the reader or the listener. So thinking about the order in which you present the information is as important as the information you present. Now, again, there are lots of ways to do this, and I've seen a lot of pitch decks that do things completely differently to the way that I'm about to propose. So it's not about right or wrong, but what I've got here is kind of how I tend to think about these things, and hopefully that will give you some suggestions about how perhaps to structure things. So once you've done your scene setting on your first page, the first thing I suggest you do is talk about the market and audience. And I'm going to talk a bit more about how to do that in a later slide. But in terms of why you do this, you really want to set the scene. Again, so you want to look at, you know, in what context are you building your business? So once you've done that, then you can start to show how you will target that market and audience. So it's very difficult to explain what you're doing without being able previously explain who you're doing it for. So if you explain your market and audience, you can then start to look at your strategy. So you can cover things like what is your USP? Now, USP is a difficult term. It gets misused a lot. Really, what you're trying to answer is, why will people play your game instead of your competitor's game? What is it that makes you different in a way that people will care about, or in a way that makes you more competitive? It might be that you found some new technology that means that you can make equivalent games for, you know, a tenth of the cost. But equally, it's probably more likely that actually you think you're doing something better that will make players move from that game to your game. You know, what is your approach? Do you have a specific way of looking at games? Is there something different in the way you approach it? What makes you good at what you do? And actually, you know, it's often really useful here to give some basics, because again, if we're looking at kind of, you know, people who don't necessarily understand games in detail, you know, it can be really useful to explain some basic terms just to kind of frame what you're doing within the context of the industry. So it might be that you want to give a bit of explanation about, you know, why games as a service is different from games as products, or you might want to explain, you know, how the strategy genres have evolved and actually how you fit within that. You know, don't assume that everybody has the context to know that the problem you're trying to solve is one that actually exists. What are your growth plans? And I mean this in terms of your team and your product and service. A lot of decks don't really explain the team that they're going to grow, and considering in games our teams are everything, it's really important that, you know, you talk about, you know, the roles you're going to hire, how you're going to grow on that side, as well as the products and services you expect to release. Now, you're probably only going to have the design or, you know, more detail on your first game. That's okay. But you do need to kind of build and I normally do this with, you know, 5-year diagram. You know, okay, game 1 here, game 2, game 3, whatever it is, and all the other things that are going to go on underneath it. So just build a picture of, you know, how you're going to grow as a company. And then what is your go-to-market strategy? So are you going to self-publish? Are you going to publish? Do you not know yet? Are you looking at both options? You know, how will the game be marketed? How will you acquire users? How will you build an audience? You know, all these things. I think it's really important to particularly be clear about whether you're going with a publisher or not. The reason being that if you are planning on going with a publisher, they're going to take a very large chunk of the game revenue. Now, that might be fine because they might add so much value, and a lot of them do, that will justify it. But that fundamentally changes your forecast. So if you don't know which one you're going to do, you probably need 2 forecasts. And, you know, not all publishers are equal. So getting a deal with Sony is very different potentially to getting a deal with a smaller publisher. And again, all these need to be thought through in terms of your forecast. And I would also argue that nowadays, you know, you want to be building your own audience. You know, you don't want just to hand all that off necessarily. So even if you are going to work with a publisher, there are likely things that you need to do. And so that needs to be thought through. And then what IP will you create? I think it's really important to actually clarify this because again, not every, if people aren't games experts, it may be particularly useful, but I do think, IP is what makes your company valuable. And so actually just taking the time to state that is a really useful exercise. And then the final point in the strategy section is, what are your key risks? I'm going to go into detail on that later, but just to sort of say that is something you need to cover. So once you've talked about your strategy and what you're going to do, then you want to build on that to justify why you're the people to do it. And so in here you have typical stuff: team, about the company, track record, and so on. I think most people get this bit really well in their pitch, but it's just making sure that the points that you talk about the team and the company really back up why you're doing what you're doing and why you're the people to deliver it. And I would back one of the other things, that if your team isn't that experienced, that's okay. Be honest about that. I think there are things like advisors and stuff like that you can bring in that can help, and I think putting all those things in there is really useful. And then once you've done that, so by this point you've said what you're doing, why you're doing it, and why you're the people to do it. Now you want to say, well, how is all of that going to result in money? So at this point, I normally put a financial section where I look at the forecast outgoings and the assumptions of that, and the forecast revenues and the assumptions of that. Forecasting revenues is very difficult. It's something that a lot of people struggle with. Really, the key is to not think about it in terms of a forecast, but to think about it in terms of what could success look like. If my game is successful based on these assumptions that I'm listing here, what could my game make based on where the market is now? And the way to do that is gather data on other similar games and do some analysis on that. It's perfectly fine to have a low, medium, and high forecast. And as I said earlier, if you've got different potential factors that could alter that forecast, then it's important to be clear on those as well. But really, the key with the financials is the assumptions, because everybody knows that whatever you say you think you might make, you won't make that. It's impossible to predict. But what is important is the assumptions are evidence-based, and that you can make the case of why you believe these figures are correct. That's really all it's about. So then once you've said how much money you're going to make, you want to talk about the investment proposition. So you want to explain what you're offering to the investor if they get involved. So key things to talk about here are the current share structure, investment to date, what money's been put in and so on, where you are right now, what you want and what you're offering for it. So I'm going to talk about valuations a bit more later, but suffice to say, it's often missing in pitches and it's really needed. I also suggest it can be useful to put in what your minimum investment amount is. So, you might end up getting multiple investors, together, who all put in a smaller amount of money to make up the total amount. It's really useful to have a note in there about what the minimum amount is from any one person. And then a bit more detail about what you'll do with the money and the runway. It's really important to state runway. Is it going to be 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and then how are you going to fund after that? So are you going to be raising more investment? Are you assuming that the revenues from the game are going to sustain you? It's really important to sort of explain the longer term and how you're going to manage financially. And, obviously with the current situation, that's going to, the runway is going to be a key factor. And stating whether you're going to raise further investment is important, because it could affect the valuation. Because if you're going to raise further money, particularly in the near future, that means that your investors will get diluted, and therefore, that needs to be taken into account when they work out, what they might, what percentage they might want for it. Now, I should note that if you're in the UK and if you're going for what we call SCIS and EIS, there will be additional things that you need to add to your pitch deck, but I'm not going to go into that today because that's kind of a whole thing in itself. If there is anyone here who wants to ask questions about that or talk about that separately, I'm happy to do that. So, as I said earlier, the market and the audience. So, building a company isn't about your first game. It's not about the details of your production processes. Yes, they need to know that you can deliver, but what is more important is why this business now. And this comes down to two main areas: the market and the audience. So in terms of the market, there are two key things really. One is explaining what market you're in. So, what I normally expect to see is a slide about the entire games market, get the typical newsy slide. but it does set the scene. Okay, confirms this is the market you're in, but then you're also in some kind of subsector. So this is for your business as a whole, not your first game. But maybe you're making virtual worlds. Maybe your specialty is mid-core mobile games. Maybe you're making I don't know, hyper casual games. Whatever it is, you need to explain the size and the growth of that addressable market to make the case of why it's an attractive market. You need to consider also any macro environmental factors. So, for example, if there was a global pandemic going on, how is that going to affect your market going forward? There is actually already, quite a lot of analysis and data out there on, how people are thinking this is going to be affected. So there's certainly stuff out there. But, you may need to do some analysis yourself as well. But, you need to look at, not just where your market is now, but where it's going to be in 1, 2, 3, 4 years, and how it's going to grow. Now, not all markets are growing. I mean, in games, most of them are, but, you may not be a company targeting the next big thing, and that's okay. Yes, some investors only want to do that, only want to invest in kind of what the next thing is, but there's also plenty of investors that want to, an investment in other areas. If your market isn't growing, though, you need to make the case for why it's attractive. So if you don't, you need to identify the fact that it's not growing, point out why that still presents you an opportunity. So it might be that you've found an opportunity to disrupt it. It might be that you've realized that, it's stagnated and you can go and buy up a load of games and that, you can make some good revenue through that. Whatever it is, you need to explain in the context of the market. And then you need to explain what the gap or the disruption opportunity you found is. So it's not enough to love a genre and think you can do it better. Particularly, it's not enough to love a genre and think you can do it better and only have your opinion to back that up. You need a reason to justify why you're going to be able to compete in that space. And the best way to do that is to present analysis of your competitors and show how you're filling a gap or you're disrupting something there. And to be clear, it doesn't matter if the investors you're pitching to already know your market. You can be pitching to the most experienced game developers turned investors in the world. This is still valid, because if you don't explain the market you're in, then the assumption is that you don't know it. So it doesn't matter that they know it, they'll think you don't. So showing an understanding of the market, where it is now, where it's going, the fact that you're able to analyze it, to understand it, and to position yourself within it will build confidence that your business model and your pitch is confident, but also it'll build confidence in you as a team. And then we look at audience. So who are your audience? And yeah, please do not put male 18 to 35. Audiences are only useful if they're targetable. So, the purpose of defining an audience is so you can reach them. So they need to be defined to a level of detail where that is possible. So there's a few different things, suggestions we have for this. So one is that, personas are actually a very useful way to do this. There are other methods too, but it's one we find particularly useful. And by we, I mean Oscar, because he's the marketing guy. But most games don't have a single audience. So the way we tend to look at it is looking at primary, secondary, and tertiary audiences. So we look at primary as who you're really making the game for, so the exact target audience. Secondary is the people who, if this game exists, will probably play it. And then tertiary are the people that, if you can get them to play it, will expand the scale of your game. And particularly on a game as a service, a free-to-play game on mobile, those tertiary audience is critical, because that's the only way you're going to get the numbers that you really need. Now, the other way to think about it is that primary is about your core mechanic. Who will love the core mechanic of your game? Secondary is all the context loop, and tertiary is the meta game. Now, I won't go into detail on those terms. They're things how we look at game design. So there's probably other resources on our website, and you can watch almost any talk that Oscar's ever done to find out a bit more about that. But the other way to look at it, another factor is that within these audiences, a useful way to define it is by what other games or media they're accessing. Because if you know that, then that potentially gives you quite an easy route to access them. And then you need to think about how are your games going to build on each other in terms of audience over time. So if you're going to be making 5 games over 10 years, or whatever it is, you need to think about taking the audience with you, because actually that's the best way for your business to grow. And this is why handing off the responsibility for building an audience to a publisher is not necessarily a great business model for an equity investor, because actually that is the value. you know, most of the time now you see that actually the, you know, publishers can work with developers and developers can build the audiences and communities themselves. And I really think that that is absolutely critical, because you need to show how your company will grow, how your audience will grow over time. And then what you're really doing through all of this section is building the basis for your argument in the next section when you look at your strategy of why this game. Because at this point you're saying, this is the market, this is the audience within that market, and then you're going to say last, what is it that that audience wants? So obviously the core mechanics, you know, you're going to say, well, you know, I'm making a strategy game and I'm going to target gamers who play strategy games. But actually, not just about that. It's about playtime, devices, social features, mode of use, motivation. Like, all these things matter. And if you can set the scene here and do this analysis at the beginning of your pitch, then when you come into doing the strategy, you can say, okay, this is why my game is designed like this. It's not just designed like this because I think it's cool. It's designed like this because that is what our data and research tells us about the audience. And that is really when your pitch starts to become much more credible, because you're starting to base it on evidence rather than just opinion. So next slide, please. So risks. Every business has risks, but most pitches I see don't talk about them. And in my view, the worst thing you can do is ignore them, because all that will do is make the investors think that, or worry that you might not have considered them. And if you haven't considered them, you can't put strategies in place to deal with them. So, you know, again, there's multiple ways to do this. You know, I've seen some pitches where people kind of address it throughout the deck, absolutely valid. Personally, I actually really like to put in a specific slide about key risks. You know, I tend to build a whole spreadsheet of all different kinds of risks, but I tend to pull out probably 3 to 5 key risks. And I'll talk, you know, I'll sort of put what the risk is, the mitigation strategy, and the probability versus severity. And you really, what you're looking at, you know, when you're nailing it down, you know, to only 3 or 5, is what are the biggest risks in your business overall. And these are, you know, there probably are some macro environmental factors as well. So it might be things outside of your control, and that's okay. But, you know, at least one of your biggest risks should be critical sales failure of your game, because that is possible for every game ever. We're a hit-driven business, and you could do everything completely right and your game could still fail. But, you know, what investors want to know is that if that happens, you've got a strategy, because they're not just in this for game one. They're in the business, and they want to know that you are going to not run away if game one fails, and they're going to know that you've got strategies in place to at least help mitigate the risk of the business failing if your game fails. Because, unfortunately, the reality is that most companies' first games do fail. So if you're not planning for that, then it raises questions about, you know, how much you've thought through your business plan. Do you really understand the market and all these kind of things? So, and then highlighting the risk also helps build a critical aspect of your pitch, which is trust in the team. So, you know, the team is what matters to investors. In fact, one investor told me recently that in terms of sort of importance, team is 80% for them. And I think that's actually probably the case for everybody. But, you know, investors need to know that when things go wrong, because they will, every business faces challenges. When things go wrong, you're a team that's going to rise to the challenge. And you're going to do everything you can to solve it, and you're committed to the long term. You're not just going to go, oh well, game one failed, let's go and do something else. If that is your approach, and that's absolutely fine, you should not be going for equity investment. You can't just have the attitude that you're going to walk away if the first game fails. So you need to think and put all these things in place to show that you're really thinking about how to deal with the challenges you could face. So KPIs. If anyone's seen a talk by Oscar on almost any topic, not only will he have talked about mechanic, context, and metagame, he will probably have talked about data. And I'm going to talk about data as well, because whilst he's talking about game data, the same applies to your business. I really believe being clear and specific makes everything better. It makes your relationships better. It makes you you're able to assess your own progress as well as present that to other people. And so, you know, when it comes to the goals of your company, they should be really specific, and they should be things that you can assess easily. So it's obviously really important to have a forecast, but realistically, that kind of shows a 3-year or 5-year forecast. You can't wait that long to know if you're succeeding or if you're not succeeding, what you need to change. So you need to really think about what your short-term goals are and how you're going to demonstrate progress to yourself, but also to any stakeholders on a regular basis. Now, you may not include this in your pitch deck, so it is a slight, but in your first pitch deck, but it's really important that you have these because these should influence the other things that you do put in your pitch deck. And I think this is something that you do need to be able to demonstrate that you've thought about and be ready to answer questions on. Now, I actually do like putting in a pitch deck, but it really depends, on the context. But, I do think, just before I talk a bit more about that, in terms of business plans themselves, being KPI focused and goal focused also helps you to have a short business plan, because long business plans, well, A, are just really annoying and no one reads them, and B, I don't think are very useful, because a bit like a game design document, business plans should be a living document, and they should be a useful tool for you to to evolve your strategy. They're not something you just write for the sake of someone else. They're actually something that you should be writing to help you. So you need to keep it short, concise, and easy to iterate on. So that means you need it to be data focused, because if it's not clear what the KPIs are, how can you assess them? So we like to define KPIs. What your KPIs are depend on the business. In the first year of a company, if you're making a game, you may not have released that game yet. So your KPIs might be development milestones. It might be, player data from a closed alpha test. It probably is other things as well, because this isn't just about the game, it's about the business. So there may be other factors that you need to consider. I would suggest that having 3 key KPIs is probably a good number. You may want to go up to 5, but I would say no more than that. And I would suggest that, particularly at the start of a business, you want to be reviewing them at least quarterly. And then you review it, iterate, and see what you need to change. And these shouldn't just be lip service to investors. This should be how you run your business, in my view. But there is another reason to state these KPIs clearly, which is stakeholder relationships. So once you do have people like investors involved in your business, you do have to report to them. And if you don't make that process easy for yourself, it can become a real pain. It can take a lot of time to do the report. It can trigger a lot of questions on behalf of from the investors, and actually that can then become a pain for the investors as well, because they don't understand everything and so on, and it can just become a real distraction to actually you running the business. So having a reporting structure that's really easy, clear, goal focused, with clear KPIs will make your life a lot easier. I'm actually planning on writing a specific article about this sort of thing next. So if anybody thinks that would be useful, it'd be great to hear. But I'm going to look at the first few months post-investment and the sort of things that you might want to set up to make your life easier going forward. So valuation, which is the most common question I think I get about pitch decks. As I said earlier, most pitch decks I see don't say what they're offering in return for the money they're asking for. And I can't stress enough, you need to say what you're offering. And there's three reasons I think I've got why this is the case. So number one, the investor's going to ask anyway. They need to know. And so this just speeds things up, basically, and avoids, having to go, them to ask later. Secondly, whilst there is going to be negotiation, because that's all the valuation is, if you're, thinking you want to give away somewhere between 5 to 10%, and the investor, is the type of company that always wants 50%, well, it's probably better knowing that up front, because actually either you can agree that, you might not want to continue, or you can have that conversation, but it's better to know up front where you stand. But then thirdly, and most importantly, it demonstrates that you understand valuations and market norms, assuming that your valuation is reasonable, but that puts you in a stronger position during negotiations, and again, will build trust in your team. And that's really the key. So how do you work out what to offer? So, I mean, the reality is, as this quote says, everything is worth what its purchaser will pay for it. And that really is true when you're a pre-revenue company, because you don't actually have anything to value. But using your forecast as a basis of valuation is really the starting point. So a key part of the valuation is likely to be negotiated around whether the investor thinks your forecast is reasonable. So going back all the way back to when I talked about assumptions on forecast earlier in this talk, if the assumptions are solid and you've got evidence basis for it, that makes your valuation stronger, which makes your negotiating pitch position stronger. So, you know, what you want is to be able to really kind of make that argument and make the forecast realistic. So it's hard. So it's, you know, the investor does think it's reasonable. And most forecasts I see are, in my view, over optimistic. So you really do need to do proper research and work out what really you can do, because the reality is the investor will know, and all you over egging your potential as a business does is draw into question your ability to assess your own business. It doesn't fool an investor. It doesn't make them think your business is going to make more money. And then you need to think about what are the market norms. So there are various ways of doing this. You know, one is to use valuation methods like the venture capital method, which require industry ratios. So there's a ratio called the price to earnings ratio, which each industry has. I think the games industry is 27, which is incredibly high. But that's based, well, actually I won't go into that, but there are these ratios you can use and then methods you can use. But actually, you know, the other thing you can do is just ask other developers who've raised a similar amount of money in a similar way, what percentage they gave away. And actually that can be a really good starting point, because what you want to do is make sure that whatever you do think you're worth is reasonable. And then the key is your assumptions. So, you know, there is no correct or incorrect valuation for a pre-revenue business. It is only interpretation of assumptions, and primarily interpretations of forecasts plus other factors that you can make a case for. So maybe you can say, well, you know, okay, the forecast shows that, you know, if we did well, you know, if we did well in this market, we could make X. But, you know, actually, we've all come out of the studio that made the best game ever in this space, that made the most money. And therefore, you know, we think that actually this valuation, you know, the forecast is reasonable, and therefore our valuation should be higher, and so on. The more evidence-based your assumptions, the stronger your argument. And that's really all it comes down to. It's a debate, it's a negotiation, and your job with a valuation and with a forecast is to put yourself in the strongest position to get the best valuation you can. So that's it in terms of my key tips, but I've just got a few resources that we have, all free, which I just wanted to highlight. So firstly, we have a financer list, which lists all of the finances we're aware of. It does focus on UK and Europe, but a lot of investors are obviously global. So a lot of it there is suitable for everybody. We then also have an event directory, which is new actually. We decided that considering all the changes to events going digital, being cancelled, change dates and so on, it would be useful to have an event directory available for everybody to see. You can search on there by whether they're digital or not. We do put changes to events and so on, and we try and keep it up to date. And then we have some free templates. We have a marketing plan template, a live ops template, and a business strategy template, which is actually based on business model canvas, which I'm a big fan of because it's a one-page business plan. But we've adapted it for games specifically. So I've used that a lot, and I found that very useful. And then we have our knowledge base as well, where we have articles, webinars, all our other content. And there's a lot on there because it goes way back to when Oscar was doing things years ago. So hopefully that'll be useful. So in summary, you know, pitch decks take time, but fundamentally think about the audience and what they need, because that's what a company is about. You try and step back and think through the story that you're building in someone's mind. Are you answering the questions that they're going to be asking themselves as they'll be asking them? Are you leaving them excited but clear on the proposition? And get feedback. You know, obviously get that from people as you're making it, but also when you do pitch to investors, there's no harm in asking them for feedback. You know, they won't offer it without you asking, but I think a lot of people actually will be quite happy to do that. And remember, different types of funding require different pitch decks. All the stuff I've talked about today has been very specific to equity investment. Some of the stuff will apply, but there will be a completely different focus if you're looking for another type of funding. And I think that's it. Are there any questions?
Yes, there are. We've got a couple. So I'll kick off with Monty's question he was asking earlier. Is there a big difference between publishers and investors? This is in the context of understanding your audience. Is there a big difference between publishers and investors? In the context of like who you're pitching to.
in terms of the pitch deck itself.
Yeah, I mean, so
yeah.
I mean, my view is that there is quite a big difference, not least because they have a very different set of agendas. So a game publisher might be more interested in the game part of it,
so
whereas an investor would be more interested in company.
If you go back to that previous slide, actually,
let's work out which slide.
So just literally the one before this with the breakdown. Yeah. So I mean, this is actually from a different talk I did, but this looks, so just as an example, you know, in your executive summary on an equity investment slide, you'd be talking about vision statement, you know, platform, dates, business model, you know, what your business is trying to achieve, all the stuff I talked about, and then game funding, you'd be talking about, you know, the game elevator pitch, you know, and so on. And then the market opportunity, you talk about why this company now, whereas games, you talk about why this game now, and so on. So it really does filter through everything. I think you do need two fundamentally different pitch decks, in my view.
Yeah, I think there's another aspect which I think has been introduced through the hyper casual game market, which isn't strictly speaking investment in the classical sense, but there are kind of like retainer-like agreements between some of these hyper casual publishers and some developers. So they are interested in you as a company, but in the context of how much your throughput is in terms of new concepts. So I think that's slightly off track from the investment process, but it's still an important way of thinking about how publishers are different.
Yeah, and you know, publishers obviously need to make their money from one game, whereas equity investors are, you know, probably going to be in your business for 5 years, 7 years. So it's a very different proposition in terms of what they're going to want as well.
I do think they have similarities in the sense that they will have a portfolio mindset. So they'll be looking to fill specific needs in their portfolio, but that what they mean by a portfolio might be very different things.
Yeah, the biggest, one of the most common issues I see with when I get pitches for equity investment is that they are actually pitches for publishers, but the developer doesn't realize that. That is absolutely the number one challenge that I have. So it's really important to look at them differently.
So Wu is asking, can you talk about VR games?
That's a good question, because we've been doing some research on that, Oscar.
I was going to say.
So, I think, you know, well, actually, Oscar can probably tell you more, but you know, clearly the market is growing, which is, I think, what the data we've been looking at says. You know, I think it's still one of those areas where it's very, it's not established, and it's very difficult to, you know, make a case commercially. Now, you know, I do see more you know, there was kind of this period a few years ago where lots of people wanted to invest in VR, and then nobody wanted to invest in VR. And I think now we're starting to see less. We're not seeing the sort of rush that there was before, but I think we are starting to see that investors are potentially a bit more open to it, because there is a case to be made for it, because some games are actually doing well. It's
a very mixed bag, though. Obviously, you know, the core VR players are still hungry for content. There's not enough of them, arguably, but they are still there. The Oculus Quest is a complete game changer in terms of user experience. I say that from a personal experience. I just literally bought one myself, and it's easier to play on my Quest than it is to play on my console, and that surprised me. That's a massive game changer. So the question is, will that be sustainable? And I think that's why we have some people still investing in VR, but not huge numbers. It's not the majority.
Yeah. I would say, I think, I'm actually, I mean, there may be investors out there who I'd say I was wrong, but from my experience, it's still very difficult to raise money for VR right now. But I do think it's better than it was perhaps a year ago.
Yeah, I think the reality is that those people who are doing VR are still looking at the potential for what they call location-based, so venue-based experiences. However, I think that excitement about the potential for that seems not to be transferred. I mean, there are some examples like the Void out there, which are great experiences, but they don't look like they're going to be mass market propositions. And when mobile is so mass market, it drags all of the interests, you know, or at least the vast majority of people's interest. So I think PC and console and mobile are so strong, it's very hard to get attention in VR and AR.
Okay.
Cool. So we'll do that. Hopefully, we'll that answered your question. Next up, Zazuz was asking, how do you approach forecasting when you're targeting a next-gen platform or a disruptive genre?
Oof. So yeah, I mean, the less data that's available, the harder it is. I think the best thing that you can do. Well, okay. So what would I do if I was targeting a next-gen platform? I would try to find data from the last time the last release of platform was, and look at the curve, because what we tend to see in games is that there's like a cycle. A new platform comes out and so on. There's a repeatable cycle that happens every decade or whatever when a new platform comes out. So I think that from that you could start to see, well, based on where the revenues are now, where are we in that curve, and therefore what is likely to happen when the next gen platform comes out. Now again, you can't guarantee it, because every time a new set of devices comes out, one does better than the other. But again, you're starting to build some assumptions. So I think you could base it on kind of what happened last time, and then I think you could base it on the type of game and the genre that you're doing. And I think also factors like, are you going to be a sort of launch title or not? And so I think you basically would need to pull data from specific points. Where in the cycle last time, what was the data like, and then compared to actually where your genre is now. Does that make sense? I think also the other thing actually that I would do in that instance is I would speak to, if you can, speak to the platform holders and see what their priorities are, because I know, for example, right now that Sony already know what sort of games they are and are not first party funding for the next gen platform, and they have very specific genres that they are and aren't. So knowing what those priorities are, I think, would help as well.
I think particularly this next generation, I think there's a couple of issues there. One is the backwards compatibility means that making a disruptive step on the next generation platform, unless it's backed by a major publisher and or Sony or Microsoft accordingly, will be a struggle to pull off, because the cost of implementation versus return will be hard to justify. But in general, disruptive forecasts are about identifying where specifically you're going to have an impact on the audience, and then making assumptions based on that impact.
Yeah, and I think I mean, it depends what kind of disruption, but I think another way can be, depending what it is, you may be kind of merging things in a new way. So there may be other games that have done the similar thing, but maybe in different genres. So if that is the case, or maybe it's something from outside of games or whatever it is, but if you're kind of, most things are iterative, so usually you're kind of merging something from something else. If that's the case, then you can start to do like a positioning analysis and work out how you sit within that, and then use that as data and assumptions on which to build a forecast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does that answer that question? That was a tough question.
It is a tough one. Yeah. I mean,
but it is really hard to build forecasts. Like it's not easy. It's not something that should be easy.
I have a sort of sadomasochistic pleasure from doing them. They're always painful, but we're starting to sort of find better structures to form them. But it's always difficult when you're dealing with a game that's non-standard.
Yeah, and I was about to say, you may just find that some investors just don't agree with your assumptions. But others will. It's okay. If you really believe that your assumptions are right, and they're as reasonable as they are, you can have that debate with an investor, and they may say, well, we actually don't believe this because of, this reason, and you can have that debate. And if you end up agreeing with them, you can go and adjust your forecast accordingly. That's okay. But it's just, if an investor says to you, why do you think this is the case? Then you need to be able to say, because of this evidence base.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point. It's like, you need to be realistic about what it is that matters. And actually, when you look at games, quite often, a game that has nothing to do with the genre that you're trying to produce, but everything to do with the audience you're trying to target, can really be the most important to compare with.
Sorry, can I just say, I've just realised I've done this entire talk with the banner behind me backwards.
Oh, really?
Ta-da!
Oh, that's funny.
Cool.
Such is like, I know you're looking fine. It's it's all fine from the recording point of view. All good stuff. So so hopefully that's helped. Does anyone else have any other questions while we're here? think it looks like we're done. So anyway, I hope that was useful. Like I say, if you have any further questions or you want to ask us anything, so obviously slides wise, that's a good question. We're going to take the recording from this and make that available to you. And also we'll make the slides available to you. Also, Ella wrote an article in gi.biz recently on this topic, so we'll include a link to that also. If anyone has any sort of further questions, want to find out more about how we help people, obviously what our focus is about bringing games to live. That means helping you understand how to get your game in front of a live audience and focusing on kind of the growth aspect, the kind of long-term success of the game, because we're interested in more games getting more people doing more things more often for longer. And so we're interested in helping teams with great concepts get access to funding and helping build their kind of proposition, because we can support them through live ops as a service. So that's what we're about. If you have any questions about that, anything about the pitching side that Ella's been talking about, or any other areas to do with live ops as a service, then please feel free to reach out to us. And on that note, unless anyone's got anything else, thank you very much.
Bye.
Cheers, guys.